Isn't it strange that the beginning of December saw Russia claim that it had captured the city of Pokrovsk? Yet here we are, 2 weeks later, and Russia is still launching attacks in Pokrovsk. If we didn't know any better, we'd say the Kremlin was lying about the fall of the city. Pokrovsk still stands, and Russia's attacks on the city are still going about as well as they have been throughout December. This time, Vladimir Putin's forces attempted a surprise assault at Pokrovsk, in an attempt to complete the conquest that the Kremlin claimed weeks ago. Ukraine was ready for the assault and crushed it so quickly that it barely got off the ground. In the latest frontline report published by Euromaidan Press, the outlet reveals that geolocated footage shows an entire Russian column attempted to launch an assault against Pokrovsk. That column didn't get far. Within a kilometer, or about 0.62 miles, of the column's staging area, there now lies the detritus of another failed Russian assault. Worst of all for Russia, this wasn't one of the many on-foot assaults that Putin has ordered in the battle for Pokrovsk. The Russian soldiers were on motorcycles, and they still got shredded into pieces by Ukrainian drones that were lying in wait for their arrival. Russia thought it had planned the perfect sneak attack, but it just sent more of its soldiers into a trap that Ukraine sprung with brutal efficiency. Russia had the smart idea for its sneaky lightning assault because it had spent the last few weeks failing to penetrate into Pokrovsk, north of the railway line that runs into the city. Ukraine needs to hold that railway line, as the new Voice of Ukraine revealed in a November 21st report on one of Russia's many failed assaults. Keeping the railway line open ensures Ukraine still has an entry point into Pokrovsk that serves future liberations, as well as an escape route for those soldiers who are currently defending against Russia from inside the city. Toward the end of November, the new Voice of Ukraine reported Ukraine had started adjusting its defensive tactics by increasing the number of unmanned aerial vehicle or UAV crews operating in key locations such as the Pokrovsk railway. Russia ended up feeling the brunt of that strategy shift during its surprise assault, but we'll come back to that later in the video. First, Russia had to actually stage its attack. Having figured out that its soldiers were making no headway in the direction of the railway line, Russia decided that the western flank would be a better target. The railway would be bypassed entirely, with Russia's forces instead advancing toward the settlement of Hryshyne that sits on the outskirts of Pokrovsk. On the surface, it seems like a smart approach for several reasons. In addition to Russia no longer throwing soldiers into a railway meat grinder, a successful attack on Hryshyne also allows Russia to take a step closer toward isolating the northern regions of Pokrovsk that its forces have yet to capture. The pressure on Pokrovsk would grow as Russia's soldiers could endanger Ukraine's supply routes while pushing on from a new staging area to make the multi-front assault on the city even more intense. Forcing a Ukrainian withdrawal is the ultimate goal, as Euromaidan Press says. Russia is desperate to avoid more of the direct assaults and house-to-house urban combat that has seen Ukraine churn through Russia's troops ever since Putin ordered the capture of Pokrovsk. Russia would much rather base itself in a nearby village and eventually complete the encirclement of Pokrovsk, so that Ukraine's defenders are forced to withdraw due to a lack of supplies and reinforcements. Ukraine's 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Air Assault Forces of the Armed Forces has been monitoring the situation in and around Hryshyne. It took to Telegram to explain the Russian approach, along with the general gist of the Ukrainian response. About the situation in Pokrovsk, the enemy shows the greatest activity on the western outskirts of the city. Using units of the 76th Air Assault Division, the enemy is attempting to break through toward Hryshyne, northwest of Pokrovsk. To do so, it intends to advance simultaneously along several directions, the 7th Rapid Response Corps explains. The defense forces are countering these attempts by cutting off likely routes of enemy movement and striking the enemy with available forces and means, in particular artillery and FPV drones, the Corps adds. Cutting off likely routes is the key phrase in that statement. Ukraine just did that to devastating effect, crushing a Russian surprise attack in the process. Of course, an attack can't be crushed until it's launched, and Russia believed that it had all the answers for the taking of Hryshyne. Rather than sending in armor such as tanks and vehicles into a mechanized assault that Ukraine would easily spot, and even more easily counter, Russia chose a different approach. Sending soldiers on foot could have worked, but that would have also been slow. A trudging approach to Hryshyne would also offer Ukraine plenty of time to respond, and would only lead to more casualties. Russia couldn't afford that, especially as the reward for its surprise attack would be the claiming of a village that is just 3.5 kilometers or a little over 2.17 miles away from the parts of Pokrovsk that Russia currently occupies. The assault needed to be swift enough to cover the distance that Russia's forces needed to travel, along with being capable of transporting enough soldiers into Hryshyne to allow Russia to establish a foothold in the village. And if the majority of the assaulting column could avoid being blown to pieces by Ukraine's FPV drones, then all the better. There could only be two vehicles for the job in Russia's mind: motorcycles and buggies. The reason for the use of buggies is obvious, as they're more maneuverable than tanks and armored vehicles, even if they don't offer much in the way of protection. Buggies can also transport several soldiers each, assuming they can avoid or outrun Ukraine's drones. That's a pretty big assumption, but Russia is always willing to take this kind of risk if it means a chance of infiltrating a Ukrainian position using vehicles that don't cost much to replace if they and the soldiers inside get destroyed. The motorcycles may seem like a more confusing choice until you realize that they offer even more of the speed and maneuverability advantages that buggies bring to the table. Motorcycles are fast and are capable of the sort of quick turns that could allow their riders to avoid Ukraine's drones. That's the Russian theory, at least, and it's one that the country has put into practice throughout much of 2025. The earliest reports of Russia using motorcycles consistently come from April, which is when CNN wrote that Russia had hand-picked this type of vehicle as being ideal for evading Ukraine's drones. Russia's defense ministry certainly seemed confident in its new brainwave. Taking to Telegram, the ministry proudly shared footage of its soldiers practicing their motorcycle riding, though the video was less impressive than the presentation surrounding it. As music blares away in the background, we see a Russian soldier gingerly making their way around a track, though there are admittedly a handful of small jumps thrown in. The explosions going off around the soldier imply Russia's purpose. The bikes will evade Ukraine's kamikaze FPV drones, as long as they have a track to ride on. CNN says that Russia had been using bikes for about a year prior to the publication of the video, though these instances have been more sporadic. As of April 2025, these occasional uses were to become standard practice, as a quote that CNN shares from the Institute for the Study of War reveals. The Russian video indicates that the Russian military is likely developing a tactical doctrine for systematic offensive motorcycle usage and may be preparing to issue an increased number of motorcycles, the ISW said. And the system works sometimes. In May, former Forbes military contributor David Axe revealed that Russia's motorcycle troops had managed to capture a stretch of trenches outside Pokrovsk in an advance that managed to push the front lines about a mile forward. That advance was less due to the expertise of the riders and more a result of Ukraine inadvertently leaving a weak point in its line outside the small village of Malinivka. To their credit, Russia's riders took advantage of this weak point and even managed to weather a Ukrainian counterattack. However, this success seems to be the exception rather than the norm. Returning to the CNN report, the outlet spoke to a Ukrainian commander named Andriy Ochanash, who said that Ukraine has labeled Russia's motorcycle assaults banzai attacks. Why? Though the attacks are fast, they're also damaging to the Russian side, as well as being indicative of the country's equipment problems. They can advance very quickly, get behind the lines, Ochanash said, revealing why Russia is using bikes in the first place. However, the trade-off is that these bikes, which are supposed to be so good at avoiding drones, are anything but, meaning Russian losses are high because their unprotected riders are getting taken out as they attempt their advances. So there are major trade-offs in Russian blood for the limited effectiveness of surprise assaults using motorcycles. Russia was willing to pay that price if it meant establishing a foothold in Hryshyne, and that foothold would be something that Russia could exploit to consolidate the gains it has made in Pokrovsk's southern regions. Those regions already serve as a staging ground for assaults on the city's north, so another village being thrown into the mix would allow Russia to make those assaults even stronger. The decision was made: avoid the railway and send the bikes to Hryshyne. Russia wasn't completely ignorant of the danger that this approach presented. However, it thought that the arrival of an old friend who has so often been very kind to Russia during its many wars would be enough to take its surprise assault from a risky attempt at a village capture to an almost guaranteed success. General Winter has landed in Ukraine, and it's causing some problems. With the road into Hryshyne being in relatively good condition, which served as another boon for Russia's motorcycle troops, the arrival of bleak winter conditions in Ukraine is proving very useful for Russia. When cold winter mists and fogs descend onto the battlefield, the visibility of Ukraine's FPV and reconnaissance drones is limited to the point where it's much harder for Ukraine to spot encroaching Russian soldiers. Russia has taken advantage of this issue before, as we saw toward the end of November. Forbes reported that the arrival of winter had grounded some of Ukraine's drones on November 28th, and the outlet explained the problems that winter weather causes for these otherwise lethal UAVs. They become substantially harder to control in bad weather, especially when rain, snow, or shifting winds disrupt stable flight, Forbes contributor Vikram Mittal writes. Because these drones are small, they have very limited inertia, so even moderate gusts can push them off course or cause constant movements that the operator must constantly correct. Visibility is only part of the issue then. The size and weight of Ukraine's drones, which are massive benefits during warmer months, count against the UAVs when winter descends. Russia also thought it was in a good position because Ukraine's forces are dealing with a less than ideal situation in Pokrovsk. The sheer scale of the Russian assault on the city has forced Ukraine into defending both the northern and western parts of Pokrovsk. North of the city, the wider urban agglomeration that is on Pokrovsk outskirts is also a problem to which Ukraine has to dedicate soldiers and equipment. The scale of this operational burden has led to Ukraine's Pokrovsk defenses being spread thinner than ever before, which potentially creates the kinds of gaps that a surprise assault using motorcycles seems custom designed to exploit. There is little that Ukraine can do to deal with this problem, as Russia has dedicated so many soldiers to Pokrovsk that Ukraine's defenders are outnumbered 8-1 in some areas of the city. However, not everything was in Russia's favor. The same general winter that was working in Russia's favor has also caused some issues, as Euromaidan Press reports. The beginning of the winter season is an obstacle for the Russian efforts, because despite the presence of tree lines along the roads, they currently provide no concealment, and with the onset of snowfall, even smaller vehicles such as buggies and motorcycles become significantly easier for drone operators to detect, the outlet says. Lower drone visibility might not be as much of a problem for Ukraine as Russia might have hoped, due to the openness of the terrain its motorcycle troops need to traverse. Speed would be of the essence if Russia's soldiers were to reach Hryshyne and establish a position before the FPV drones came raining down. Russia has also experienced heavy troop losses in the Pokrovsk sector, despite its massive manpower advantage. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia lost at least 25,000 soldiers in October, most of whom died in Pokrovsk. Russia's losses in the region were lower, though still significant, earlier in the year. The Guardian reports that Ukrainian estimates suggest that Russia churned through 15,000 of its soldiers in January, and according to a November 6th report by the Center for European Policy Analysis, Russia's daily losses in Pokrovsk peak at around 700 to 800, which means the numbers advantage is slowly being whittled away. Still, the scales of the situation seem to fall in Russia's favor overall. All of the ingredients seem to be in place for a successful surprise attack. There was just one problem. For a surprise attack to work, your enemy has to be surprised by the attack. That's where all of Russia's careful planning fell apart, as Ukraine knew precisely what Russia planned to do in the Hryshyne direction, and it had a trap lying in wait for the unfortunate motorcycle-riding soldiers who were about to plow right into that trap. Euromaidan Press provides the details, stating that geolocated footage from the Hryshyne direction shows that Ukrainian drone operators detected the Russian attack almost as soon as it started. Ukraine allowed the attack to draw nearer, giving Russia's motorcyclists enough time to progress by about a kilometer in the process. But the only reason that was allowed to happen was so that Ukraine's drones could get into position. It wasn't long before the lead vehicle of the Russian column entered the kill zone that Ukraine created. That vehicle was targeted immediately, sparking chaotic scenes as Ukraine's drones zoomed in on Russia's advancing buggies and motorcycles one by one. General winter had failed to provide the level of fog that Russia needed, and the cold conditions weren't enough to send Ukraine's FPV drones flying away from their targets. Instead, the drones struck again and again, often several times per target, until every vehicle in the Russian column was destroyed less than a mile outside of its assault staging area. Additional footage shows the aftermath, with all vehicles burning simultaneously, clear evidence that multiple strikes were delivered at once, Euromaidan Press says. The outlet also says that this footage is further evidence that Ukraine wasn't blindsided by the Russian assault. A supposed surprise was anything but, as Ukraine's drones were clearly waiting for the Russian vehicles. Since drone attacks do not always achieve a kill on the first attempt, the number of destroyed vehicles indicates that dozens of Ukrainian drones were already positioned to intercept the assault, preventing any Russian unit from reaching Hryshyne, Euromaidan Press says. There were some Russian survivors, but in their panic, they couldn't continue anything that resembled a coordinated retreat, never mind a continued advance on Hryshyne. Ukraine was able to dispatch a solitary FPV drone to mop up these Russian stragglers, all of which were neutralized before they could return to base and warn anybody else of the kill zone that awaits any other units that attempt an assault on Hryshyne. The numbers tell the story of Russia's failure. By the end of the surprise attack, Russia had lost 10 of its vehicles and around 40 soldiers. Any attempt to complete an outflanking maneuver by way of Hryshyne went up in smoke, and Ukraine is now more aware than ever of Russia's attempts to bypass a lethal railway line so it can find another way into Pokrovsk. Russia now has two choices: continue the assaults that are already costing it so many soldiers, or turn its attention to another part of the Pokrovsk front line, likely in the knowledge that Ukraine's drones will be waiting to greet them there too. What we see here is Ukraine proving once again that Russia's claims of the fall of Pokrovsk were premature. The city is still being defended, costing Russia hundreds of soldiers every day. But it gets even better than that for Ukraine. After yet another grueling push for Pokrovsk has failed, it's not just Ukraine's defenses that are stretched. The Russian lines, despite having been reinforced with so much manpower, are beginning to creak. Breaks are appearing and opportunities are being taken, which have led to Ukraine liberating territory in the city that Russia said was lost to Ukraine earlier in December. On December 13th, just 3 days before Euromaidan Press published its report on the fate of Russia's failed surprise attack, UKR Inform revealed that Ukraine's forces had managed to retake a portion of northern Pokrovsk, measuring around 16 square kilometers or around 6.1 square miles. This tells us that even the sections of Pokrovsk that Russia had occupied aren't being defended anywhere near well enough for those sections to be held for long. Ukraine's Operation Task Force East took to Facebook to declare the liberation of the territory. The unit also says that Ukraine successfully repelled 18 of 19 Russian attacks in the Pokrovsk direction on December 13th, with the sole remaining attack being a fight in progress. As for further recapturing of territory, that may be coming. The Ukrainian armed forces continue to take active measures in the Pokrovsk-Mirnorad agglomeration area. These measures include improving the operational situation, conducting local operations to dislodge the enemy from certain territories, and creating conditions for subsequent maneuvers by our forces. The situation in Pokrovsk may not be as hopeless as Putin claims. Russia's attacks are being repelled and Ukraine is retaking territory. A city that Russia claims to hold is still very much an active battleground that claimed 40 of Russia's soldiers in a single failed assault, and is costing Russia hundreds more of its troops every single day. The Kremlin's narrative of complete domination in Ukraine is falling apart, and this Pokrovsk incident is just a small example of something that is happening across the entire front line of the Ukraine war. Russia's army is breaking from within as Ukraine is pushing back against exhausted Russian soldiers and shattered logistics. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the Pokrovsk direction. And thank you as always for watching.